I want to think about international exhibitions as a multimodal form of modern mass intercultural communication and soft power, involving propaganda and persuasion, but also diplomacy, negotiation and transaction in a transnational field. International exhibitions in the post-war world were an important site for the development of a specific form of visuality, of visual communication, ways of representing and of seeing, that were characteristic of post-war modernity. At the same time, the process of defining an image or visual identity in international exhibitions also shaped the nation's sense of self. So after World War II, international exhibitions as a specific medium of mass communication were the focus of intense attention and innovation in the context of post-war reconstruction, decolonisation, the rise of mass tourism, and of Cold War competition between the two world camps of socialism and capitalism. During the 1950s and 1960s, numerous mass exhibitions crossed the Iron Curtain in both directions, and this form of communication played a vital role in international relations and in restoring a sense of optimism and national unity and nation branding, as Greenhoff Hecht has called it. This was an extremely dynamic period, more broadly in the development and theorization of visual communications, including in advertising, ad mass, in television, and the early experiments in computing, which form the basis of today's powerful visual and pervasive digital imaging. The art of exhibition design also became increasingly specialized, professionalized, and theorized in light of developments in visual communication and theory of vision and in psychology of advertising and marketing and psychology of perception, from Kepes to Marshall McLuhan. Now, in a recent publication, I've proposed that the metaphor of design diplomacy provides us with a useful lens through which to examine how international relations have been materialized and played out in the multimedia form of international expositions, and conversely, how the design of such exhibitions helped to shape international relations. This paper turns this lens on the USSR's self-presentation at Expo 58 in Brussels, the first World Fair of the Cold War era, which was held for 6 months from 17th of April 1958. Focusing on the ways the Soviet exhibition planners conceived the task of presenting the USSR and socialist system to international and especially Western publics, I will explore how the Expo provided a kind of miniaturized model of global geopolitics, where the two world camps of capitalism and state socialism contested but also negotiated their claims for modernity, working out strategies for future moves, not only in terms of the message, but also the medium of exhibition design. The analogy of diplomacy usefully directs attention to the importance of dialogue and intercultural communication, even in such adversarial contexts as the Cold War. Diplomacy requires not only an assertion of difference, but also an anticipation of and accommodation with one's interlocutors' agendas, culture and idiom, a willingness to compromise, and a tacit agreement to observe the rules of civility and polite conversation. In the rhetoric used by the Belgian hosts at Brussels, the Expo was to be an exercise in international relations by cultural means. It would, they hoped, engender a new international atmosphere of dialogue, reconciliation and rapprochement between the two camps, overcoming the tensions of the Cold War and enabling greater global cooperation to address some of the pressing problems of the age through the peaceful application of science and technology. From their inception, World Fairs, being dedicated to celebrating and promoting industrial and technological progress, served as sites of exchange, transmission and internationalization. They accelerated the process of technology transfer and spread a particular form of modernity. Thus, it has been proposed that they should be viewed as sites of Cold War convergence. The geometric figure of convergence implies, however, a rather mechanistic deterministic model, to think about the complex, multi-dimensional transactions underway at the World Fair, it may be more productive to consider the Cold War Expo as a contact zone, a term drawn from cultural anthropology and linguistics to describe social spaces where disparate cultures meet, clash and grapple with each other, such as in relation to colonialism as applied by Mary Pratt. The idea of the contact zone emphasises cultural transfer or transculturation, a form of appropriation and bricolage whereby groups select and invent from materials transmitted to them by a dominant or metropolitan culture. Envisaging multiple connections and cross-fertilizations, this idea of transculturation foregrounds the reciprocal, interactive, improvisational dimensions of encounters, and the way that subjects are constituted in and through the relations with each other. Furthermore, it emphasises that the outcomes of such contact may be new, hybrid cultural products, Creole languages, for example, which enable communication without being identical with the imperial language. By analogy, although not a colonial relationship, the effects on Soviet idiom in the Cold War Expo's contact zone with the West would not necessarily result in its absorption into the language and values of the Western other, but in a new hybrid cultural identity and enhanced possibilities for effectively communicating its worldview to the other camp. Second, it exemplified the increasing importance in the post-war period of the idea of information and the use of communications technology and multisensory bombardment. The dispersed simultaneous mode of visual inattention required, for example, by the Eames's multi-screen technology has been compared by Beatrice Colomina to military surveillance technologies, such as a wartime situation room. Cutting-edge cinematic technology was harnessed to presenting the American way of life. So the Eameses made a film about the history of the computer for Brussels. The Soviet planners learned in advance how cutting-edge cinematic technology would be harnessed to present the American way of life. The chief hook and propaganda device they recorded was going to be a film, America, Land and People, projected in 360 degrees in a circorama, which was attributed to Disney. And this was to be shown for the first time outside the USA. The viewer placed in the centre was to feel like a participant in the events shown on the screen. Turning now to the Soviet response to the general theme that was set by the Belgian hosts. Common ground among the Cold War adversaries was imposed both spatially by contiguity and conceptually by the umbrella theme that was set by the Belgian exhibition organisers. This was for a more human world. According to the Commissar General, each nation was to demonstrate its own conception of happiness and the paths to attaining it. All were to demonstrate how scientific progress would improve human life for all. The common message was summed up: hope, happiness and humanism under the shadow of the atom. The fair must express, quote, hope that man on the threshold of the atomic age may find a better means of achieving human understanding and peace. Now, Western accounts of Brussels, both contemporaneous and historical, have drawn a stark dichotomy between the US and Soviet pavilions. According to Walter Hickson, while the Americans respected the fair's theme of a new humanism, the USSR, by contrast, ignored it, according to Hickson. And while the Americans seemed to be saying, relax a little and learn something of how we live, the Soviets filled their exhibition with machine tools, model hydroelectric dams, and statistics on industrial growth, as if to say, we are large, we are powerful, we have science and industry, and we owe it all to communism. So these and other accounts imply that while the US was modern, dynamic, and responsive to its audience, the USSR doggedly pursued a didactic approach that was by now outdated. The selection of exhibits and design of the displays was undoubtedly compromised in the Soviet Pavilion as a result of those internal divisions between forces of innovation and institutional inertia, between modernisation and Stalinism. However, I think that we need to be aware that the incoherence and overkill that was ascribed to the USSR Pavilion in Western accounts, both at the time and since, was a common Cold War othering trope. The contemporary and retrospective evaluations of the competing pavilions was just as much terrain for a Cold War battle of representations as were the exhibits themselves. Moreover, the condescending opinions of professional journalists and experts do not reflect the contemporary response of the lay public. American surveys during and after the fair found that the USA was lagging worryingly far behind the USSR and other Socialist Bloc pavilions in mass popularity. Much to the consternation of the US Information Agency, USIA, visitors flocked to the USSR Pavilion. In the first 3 months, of the total 10.5 million visitors to the Expo as a whole, over 7 million, so about 3/4, visited the USSR Pavilion. Surveys of visitor satisfaction supplemented with quantitative evidence. They indicated that visitors to the fair were more interested in and impressed by the Soviet Pavilion than by the USA one. One USIA survey found evidence that the Soviet Pavilion had greater favourable impact on visitor attitudes than did that of the US, despite apparently more frequent doubts about the credibility of the Soviet presentation. If Western reports acknowledged the public's interest in the Soviet Pavilion, they generally ascribed it to Sputnik alone. Sputnik was shown there, and it was very important, of course, for the Soviets that the space miracle should be there to impress visitors about how far ahead the Soviet Union was. But for the Soviets, this foreign fascination with Sputnik wasn't enough. What mattered for them was that visitors should take away the main message about the systemic superiority of socialism over capitalism. So what Soviet progress under socialism did for humanity. This required engaging on the common ground established by the Expo's umbrella theme, and doing so in terms that would be understood by ordinary Western viewers, by addressing such issues as living standards, housing and consumption, and by adopting a mode of display that would engage and accommodate Western popular exhibitionary culture. So contrary to established views, the Soviet planners conducted their deliberations in close reference to the umbrella slogan of the fair set by the Belgian hosts. They sought to embody the theme of hope, happiness, humanism and benevolent science, demonstrating socialist humanism and progress in the service of humanity and world peace. Since capitalist propaganda would definitely try to demonstrate the superiority of the capitalist system in regard to this theme of human happiness, the Soviet display must also show how, under socialism, man was at the centre of all its state institutions, all industry, of all art. Visitors must furthermore, this is according to the planning documents, take away an understanding that the socialist path to progress was not only more democratic, equitable and humane, but also faster, a message that was particularly important to project to the World Fair's virtual public in the developing world, whom the USSR was very avidly cultivating at this time. Only the Soviet socialist system was fully able to apply the benefits of scientific and technological advance to the good of human beings. So in the last bit of this talk, am I all right for time? Yeah. So in the remainder of the talk, I want to question Hickson and others' Cold War assumption of essential immutable difference, focusing instead on negotiation and cross-fertilization. Notwithstanding substantive, systemic, ideological differences in the message conveyed, there was more room in this contact zone of the World Fair for dialogic accommodation and transculturation between Soviet and Western approaches than has often been assumed. Not unlike the Americans, the Soviets illustrated the theme of progress and human happiness by emphasizing rising mass living standards and their effect on the lives of individuals and families. They aim to show how, on the basis of universal peace, a well-provided life is created for every person. Consumption and leisure were prominent themes in the Soviet displays and accompanying promotional imagery. A section was dedicated to, quote, objects of popular consumption, including textiles, clothing, shoes, wine, chocolate, and other luxuries. It aimed to demonstrate the concern of the workers' state to raise workers' living standards and the diversity and high quality of Soviet consumer goods. Yet even as the USSR joined battle on terms which the USA and its European Marshall Plan recipients had claimed as their own, it remained vital to emphasise the specifically socialist route to achieving higher living standards, not only through individual consumption, but through welfare, services, social benefits, the right to rest, state maternity and childcare provision, and importantly, through social housing. Given that housing was a major social and economic issue throughout the post-war world, this was a point on which it could appeal to hearts and minds on both sides of the Iron Curtain, as well as in the developing world. In the Soviet Pavilion's socialist take on the Expo theme of humanism and progress, the image of mass housing construction played a central role. A monumental painting by Alexander Denievka, For Peace, set the tone by identifying the Soviet peace agenda, progressive technology, and socialist modernity with the benefits of urban construction. Photographs and statistics told of the reconstruction of war-damaged cities and the construction of new mass housing regions, of schools and hospitals. Above all, the intensive industrialized housing campaign launched by Khrushchev in July 1957 served as a platform for demonstrating the party state's concern for ordinary people's welfare and the advantages of central planning. The exhibition designers were concerned to make Soviet promises and achievements in the realm of housing less abstract and more immediate to the viewer's imagination. Soviet agencies had already taken an interest in the uses that Western nations made of model homes as a display format. So in November 1957, they even invited the London Daily Mail to bring its Ideal Home exhibition to Moscow. At Brussels, the USSR Pavilion included 2 life-size models of furnished apartment interiors, such as this one, representing the new, standard, prefabricated, small-scale flats designed for single-family occupancy that had recently been put into mass production in the Soviet Union. They were fully furnished in a conservatively modern style and included kitchens where one could see domestic equipment, including refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and other electrical appliances. Thus, the viewer moved from photos and figures representing the scale of mass housing construction into the interior of an individual dwelling, where they could imagine the domestic comfort and joys of private life enjoyed by the Soviet family in housing provided by the state and the public purse. The Soviet organisers were well aware of the contradictions and pitfalls of this approach. In adopting domestic space, and specifically a home designed for an individual nuclear family as a site to project Soviet ideals and achievements, they were raiding the rhetorical arsenal and idiom of the capitalist adversary, poaching a symbol that was already closely identified with America. Believing their erroneous intelligence that the Americans would, quote, definitely show a model home, they were also nervous that this strategy of adopting the other's idiom could backfire. How would the display of prefabricated industrialized mass housing, such as this one, resonate with the foreign audience in light of anti-Soviet propaganda and in the comparative context, remembering that they thought that America was going to show this house, separate family house of 15 rooms with car porches and all the rest, and a fully fitted American kitchen. So I won't read the quote because I don't want to take the time, but they were worried that it would, their offering of modern housing was going to look backwards and not amaze foreigners. They were also worried about how a display of Soviet model homes would be received in this international comparative context. So Zhukov feared it won't be convincing, it'll rouse ridicule. it's necessary to think how it will resonate polemically with the American ones. To be sure, the kitchen equipment fell far short of the American atomic and miracle kitchens exhibited around Europe and shown in Moscow the following year at the American National Exhibition of '59. As well as of the Belgian Jacques Dupuis' futuristic electric house, that's the top one there, which was shown in the Belgian sector at Brussels. So that's the Soviet one over there, and as you can see, it's small and it doesn't have a lot of equipment. However, such kitchens as these two were received by European publics as science fiction. The Soviet kitchen, by contrast, represented a more realistic and attainable improvement on most Europeans' kitchens in the 1950s. Finally, if I've got time, just to quickly say a few words about taking on board the foreign viewer. So the final condition to consider that shaped the Soviet presentation of itself was the nature of the anticipated mass international audience, before whom this competition between East and West was played out, and which both sides supported. Zhukov and his allies were beset by questions about how best to persuade the unknown Western audience and how to ensure that their message would not get lost in translation. And like the Americans, they were concerned to do so diplomatically, tactfully, softly, in such a way that visitors would have their minds changed without realising it. So I propose that international expos can be considered as contact zones, where in the process of intercultural communication, local or national idioms underwent transculturation and hybridization. Just in briefly in this final section, I want to think about the effect of contacts both with foreign viewers and with foreign practices of display, marketing and public relations. It was one thing the Soviet planners realised, to tell the story of progress under the socialist system for an audience of Soviet citizens who were already familiar with this, and they were able to decode the messages. Exhibitions at home in the USSR, such as the All-Union Agricultural Exhibition, had trained the Soviet public to expect a particular kind of pedagogical experience. But the Soviet designers worried how to represent the Soviet path to progress in ways that would be compelling to a potentially hostile Western audience. How could they demonstrate the dynamics of progress through time and its systemic causes, the revolution, party guidance, socialist central economic planning, in the visual form of an exhibition? And how to do so in a way that the foreign audience, whose way of seeing and thinking was formed under capitalist hegemony, would stop, look and understand. So they recognised the intercultural obstacles to communicating their message about the specifically socialist origins of hope, happiness and humanism. For example, they wanted to emphasise the right to labour, guaranteed by the Soviet constitution, but Western viewers, enslaved by the alienated conditions of capitalist production and brainwashed by capitalist propaganda about Soviet oppression, might, they feared, misinterpret this. So according to Zhukov, but do Western people understand that labour is the main element of happiness? They were fearful also that viewers would project their stereotypes onto the Soviet display, orientalising it as the backward other of capitalist modernity, fears which in fact the Western accounts that I've already discussed proved to be justified. So they recognised it was vital to find exhibition strategies to counter the Western stereotypes. So they started out from an assumption that Western viewers, the subjects of capitalism, were the antithesis of the Soviet public. The latter was widely constructed as the most reading people, committed to learning and self-improvement. The West European public, by contrast, had different expectations of a day out at the fair, and a different culture of exhibition viewing. They were, and here we have the Soviet stereotypes, they were not like the Chinese who study every question in detail, and not as we understand the public in the USSR, who will stand by the conveyor belt with a notebook and study. Visitors will not come looking for further education, but merely to pass time. Therefore, we must have radio, television, give out free literature, so that they take away the impression of superiority of the Soviet order in all areas. But the trouble was that they didn't know the Western audience. They didn't know the mass viewer, to whose interests their exposition had to appeal, and whose short attention span and distracted mode of viewing it had to accommodate. They had very limited direct contact with ordinary people in the capitalist West, and they lacked systematic market research on which they could draw. So to overcome their knowledge gap, the Soviets took advice from socialist allies, such as the Belgian USSR Friendship Society. They also looked very hard at what Czechoslovakia was doing, because Czechoslovakia was really leading the way in the Eastern Bloc in terms of exhibition design. But more surprisingly, they also adopted the market research methods of the capitalist enemy, enlisting the services of a Belgian public relations consultancy, identified in the Russian report as publicites, which I think is probably a mistranslation of publicité, sort of garbled, lost in translation indeed. So, the advertising agency's report advertised the Soviet organisers that in demonstrating Soviet economic progress, the exhibition had to show that the brand made in the USSR is able to compete on world markets with international products. More broadly, they advised the Soviets to, quote, penetrate into the psychology of your interlocutor and accommodate yourself to it as best you can. So this marketing psychology, the conventional wisdom of public relations, is arguably also the basis of democracy. Not democracy, excuse me, misspoke, diplomacy. Significantly, the public, the Soviet planners imagined, with the help of this PR firm, was little different from the fairgoer that was hailed by the USA Pavilion. Like tourists, they came not for edification, but for entertainment and relaxation, a day out at the fair and a souvenir to take home, precisely the experience the American exhibit offered in its pleasure dome. Just as American advisors had cautioned their own designers, direct propaganda had to be avoided at all costs because it was likely to backfire. The mode of address, the visual language, the syntax of the display all had to take account of the foreign public's exhibitionary culture, shaped, they assumed, by modern capitalist modes of communications, ad mass, and displays such as department stores, with their multi-sensory bombardment. The viewer was imagined as suffering from what Kolomina diagnosed as the kind of collective attention deficit disorder, shaped by new technologies. This in turn made it necessary to keep pace with the international trends towards interactive and dynamic displays. Everything must turn, move, wink, catch the eye, says Zhukov. So adopting this style of tourism, rather than lecture or argue a case, the exhibition needed to lure the viewer in, using the style of tourism, they were advised. Just as the US Pavilion sought to convey a sense of ease, the consultants advised the Soviets to adopt a relaxed, unconstrained and personalised manner. Visitors must feel welcome in the Soviet Pavilion, as in a good hotel, the PR firm said. The foreign public should be met metaphorically with a smile, and, quote, every visitor must feel that he's being greeted individually, so that when they leave the pavilion, they should feel a pang of homesickness for the Soviet Union, and would say, you feel most at home in the USSR Pavilion. So, I'm going to just wrap up now, just with a brief conclusion, that the Soviet self-representation at Brussels took shape in tandem with the exhibition planners' growing understanding of the dual other, both the expected and actual displays by its main Cold War adversary, the USA, and the international, especially Western public, responding to what they thought they knew about the American plans, even if much of that turned to be wrong, encouraged by Western PR consultants, and taking on board the Western others' anticipated prejudices about the Soviet Union, Zhukov and his team identified an approach that focused on the benefits of socialism as they were felt by the individual in everyday life. The problem of trans-systemic and transcultural communication was not only a matter of the message, however, but also of the medium. To appeal to the Western viewer required a more entertaining and spectacular approach, avoiding didacticism and making the displays as visual, immediate and dynamic as possible. A new set of images of a reformed, more human-faced socialist modernity was accompanied by the beginning of a shift towards greater appeal to pleasure and emphasis on visual communication. Just final slide. While subsequent exhibitions, such as in New York the following year and the Expo 67 in Montreal, lie beyond the scope of this paper, Brussels served as a training ground for Soviet display professionals, compelling them to measure themselves against international standards and promoting appropriations and rapprochements both in the culture of display and in the iconography of progress. The more flexible and innovative institutions and individuals involved in the Soviet exhibition design came to understand that effective and persuasive communication across the Cold War divide required diplomatic compromise and accommodation. The Soviet display at the World Fair had to capture this capitalist West's rhetorical arsenal, assimilate display modes and symbols that it had made its own, and turn them against it. As in diplomatic negotiations, if the USSR was to be heard and understood in the way it wanted to be, it had to ventriloquize, strategically adopting the idiom of the Cold War adversary and translating itself into a visual language that the other would comprehend. Thank you very much for your attention.